A black and white image is shown of two European men and two Native Americans. The European men are dressed in long coats, knickers, and hats. One of them leans on a barrel while smoking a short pipe, while the other one stands with his right hand on the barrel, extending his left arm to a Native American man handing him an animal fur. The Native American man wears a loincloth, several necklaces, moccasins, has a cloth draped over his right shoulder, wears jewelry on his head, and stands in front of a pile of animal furs. His body is striped with paint, and he holds a bow and arrow in his other hand. The second Native American man squats to the right of the barrel wearing a cloth around his left shoulder, pants, and moccasins, while smoking a long pipe and blowing smoke out his mouth. In the left corner of the image, a large package tied with strings sits on the ground, and rocks, hills, and sparse bushes can be seen in the background. Figure 6.1 Furs and Tobacco. This 1777 Canadian image depicts European traders negotiating with Native Americans, called First Nations in Canada, in the course of the era's highly profitable fur trade. Note that a European and a Native American are both smoking pipes, probably filled with tobacco, another important trade good at this time. Credit: Modification of Work, a map of the inhabited part of Canada, frontispiece by William Fadden, 1777, by Library of Congress Prints and Photographs, Division/Wikimedia Commons, Public Domain. Chapter Outline. 6.1 European Colonization in the Americas. 6.2 The Rise of a Global Economy. 6.3 Capitalism and the First Industrial Revolution. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the world's great oceans effectively became highways as European explorers, merchants, and laborers proved willing to journey greater distances than they had in the past, and traveled to new destinations in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. New economic systems propelled exploration, communication, interaction, exchange, and, in many tragic cases, exploitation. Communities in Asia, Africa, and the Americas that had once had little or no contact with one another now found themselves enmeshed in a variety of exchanges. Confronted with a changing world, every community made hard decisions. Some, like the Native American seen here, figure 6.1, embraced the newcomers as trading partners or political allies, gaining access to new goods and sometimes profiting for a time. Others resisted the newcomers, often at great cost to themselves. A timeline of the events from this chapter is shown. 1492, Christopher Columbus arrives in the Americas. An image is shown of a man kneeling on the ground holding a large flag and sword, surrounded by people in a forest with ships in the background. 1519, 1521. Hernán Cortés. Forces defeat the Aztecs. An image shows an army marching with a large flag while natives bow behind them. 1587. Roanoke Colony founded. A map is shown of a country and its coast with ships drawn in the water. 1756, 1763. 7 Years' War. 1776. Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations. A profile drawing of a man with long white hair and a dark coat is shown. 1776. The United States declares independence from Great Britain. A copy of the Declaration of Independence is shown. 1811. Luddites destroy machines. A drawing of a factory shows two men destroying the machinery. 1842. China surrenders Hong Kong to Great Britain. 1848. Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. A picture shows a man in a dark suit and white hair and beard sitting in a chair. 1857, 1859. Indian Mutiny. Figure 6.2 Timeline, Colonization and Economic Expansion. Credit: 1492. Modification of Work, Columbus taking possession of the new country, by Library of Congress's Prints and Photographs, Division/Wikimedia Commons, Public Domain. Credit: 1519, 1521. Modification of Work, Codex Ascatitlan by Gallica Digital Library / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1587. Modification of work Roanoke Map 1584 by the British Museum / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1776 top. Modification of work Profile of Adam Smith by Adam Smith, Vanderblue Collection / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1776 bottom. Modification of work Declaration of Independence by Library of Congress / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1811. Modification of work Frame Breakers or Luddites, Smashing a Loom by Unknown / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1848. Modification of work Portrait of Karl Marx by International Institute of Social History / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the encomienda system, explain the motivations behind European settlements in North America, explain how climate, economics, and geography affected the founding and growth of colonial settlements, analyze indigenous responses to European colonization in the Americas. In the early 1500s, Europeans began founding new settlements in the Americas. Some came to get rich, others to win glory for their empires, a few to spread their faith. Some settlements withered and died, but others became profitable centers for international commerce as goods and people flowed across the Atlantic Ocean. Each community of Native Americans made unique choices and decided for themselves whether to embrace or resist the changing world. Regardless of their choices, however, most indigenous people suffered severely from European colonization. They could slow the European advance into their world, but they could not stop it. Spain's encomienda system. The Spanish were the first to establish major colonies in North America after Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1492. They became the earliest Europeans to force the indigenous population to labor for them, initially by outright enslavement, a practice that slowly evolved into systems that were more complex. By 1502, they had created the encomienda system as part of a broader search for God, gold, and glory in their vast empire. In this context, God refers to attempts to spread the Catholic faith, gold to the search for wealth, and glory to hopes of obtaining personal fame. The term encomienda comes from the Spanish word encomendar, which means to entrust. The encomienda was a system of entrusting valuable territories and peoples to those who had proven to the crown that they were worthy of that trust. The Spanish government gave each grantee, known as an encomendero, the right to demand labor from indigenous people living in a specific area. In exchange, the Spaniards were supposed to provide guidance, education, and leadership to these Native Americans. While encomiendas did not technically include the ownership of any land, encomenderos often took possession of lands where the people under their control lived. Sometimes the system of forced labor even devolved into what was functionally, if not legally, slavery. Most recipients of encomiendas were conquistadors being rewarded for campaigns that had won glory for Spain. However, a few Native Americans also received them. When the expedition led by conquistador Hernán Cortés fought a war against the Aztec Empire, 1519–1521, the Tlaxcalans of central Mexico allied with Cortés's forces against the Aztecs, their traditional enemies. As a reward for their service, the Spanish government gave some Tlaxcalans encomiendas, and the tribe enjoyed a far better position in the Spanish Empire than many other Native American groups. Perhaps the most unusual encomendera was Melanson, a formerly enslaved indigenous woman who served as Cortés's chief interpreter during the conquest of the Aztec Empire, figure 6.3. Melanson received her encomienda as a reward for this service, without which Cortés's campaign against the Aztecs might have failed. A drawing is shown of an army and people marching toward the right along a dark, pebbled, wavy road. 7 of the men are dressed in full armor, with only their eyes showing through their helmets. They all hold round shields, 4 hold tall spears, and 1 holds a very large red flag with 2 points, and a picture of an angel with wings and a halo on it. Behind the army on the left, there are 3 people in loincloths, and black hair carry objects by ropes tied around their foreheads. They are bent over against the weight. In the middle of the army there is a white horse, and in front of the horse is a dark-skinned man with long black hair, wearing a shirt, short pants, tights, and hat. He is holding a spear. In the front of the army on the right there is a man wearing an armored coat, short striped red and white pants, white tights, holding his black top hat in his hand. He has red hair and a beard. In front of him stands a woman with dark pinned-up hair and a red and white dress with her arms outstretched. A blue oval stamp is in the top right of the picture. Figure 6-3, a Native American encomendera. This page from an Aztec manuscript of the 16th or 17th century shows the Spanish army on the march, with Cortés and the translator named Melanson at the far right. Credit: Codex Azcatitlan by Gallica Digital Library/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Encomenderos typically abused their authority, overseeing an exploitive arrangement marked by horrific working conditions and acts of extreme violence against anyone who failed to comply with their demands. The encomienda system became the dominant source of labor in Spanish American colonies, which included areas now known as Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Mexico, and much of South America, figure 6. 4. A world map is shown. In North America, a small sliver on the western coast of Canada, most of the United States, except the eastern region and Great Lakes. The islands in the Caribbean and Central America are shaded. The northwestern region of South America, including the connecting tip of Central America, are shaded. The southern part and western coast of South America is shaded. Figure 6-4 Spain's colonies. This map shows the area controlled by Spain in its colonization of the Americas. Native American communities often retained effective control over territory that was claimed by European powers. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. After a brief period as an encomendero, in 1514, the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas became one of the system's greatest critics. Figure 6. 5. He spent most of the next decade traveling across Latin America and Spain, speaking out against its brutality. In his 1552 book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, Las Casas argued that the Spanish fell like ravening wolves upon Native Americans. He claimed the Spanish tear the natives to shreds, murder them, and inflict upon them untold misery, suffering, and distress, tormenting, harrying, and persecuting them mercilessly. Las Casas eventually convinced King Charles V to implement the new laws of 1542 that sought to end the encomienda system, but Spanish settlers in the Americas violently opposed the reforms, and the system remained. Image A is a painting of the profile of a man sitting in a chair writing on white paper at a table with a feathered pen. He has hair around the crown of his head, a large nose, rosy cheeks and lips, and is wearing a dark flowy hooded cloak over a white shirt. A cross hangs from his neck. The background is dark and the words D.Fr. Bartolomé de las Casas are shown across the top with the year 1566 underneath. Part B is the cover of a book. A square portion in the middle shows an elaborate shield with stripes, lions, and fleur-de-lis decorations throughout. Feathered wings extend out of the shield on both sides, and eagles' heads come out in 2 directions at the top of the shield with a crown in between. Words in red and black are written below the image. The bottom of the shield shows an animal claw extending out of the shield on each side and clasping around a column with a rounded ball on top. Across the top of the book cover in a rectangle, a tall fountain with animal heads on top stands in the middle with a 4-legged, pointy-nosed animal with wings for ears on either side. Both animals' reins lead to the hand of a naked person sitting atop the animal. Behind each is a snarling head of a dog that is wound up inside itself. Along both the sides of the cover are identical rectangles with a tall column intricately carved with feathers, tassels, and animals. Across the bottom rectangle, a short fountain sits in the middle with beasts' heads on either side, leading to a horn where swirls and another beast head spills out. Figure 6. 5 Bartolomé de las Casas. Shown in a 16th century portrait by an unknown painter, Bartolomé de las Casas was one of the most outspoken critics of the encomienda system. B. The cover of his book, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, is shown. Credit a modification of work Portrait of Bartolomé de las Casas by General Archive of the Indies/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of work, cover of A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies by John Carter Brown Library/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Dueling Voices. The Impact of Spanish Colonization. For insights into Spanish colonization, consider the two following primary sources. The first written by Christopher Columbus in 1492, and the second by Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest, looking back in 1542 after approximately 40 years of experience in Spanish America. Thursday, October 11. All I saw were youths, none more than 30 years of age. They are very well made, with very handsome bodies and very good countenances. Their hair is short and coarse, almost like the hairs of a horse's tail. They neither carry nor know anything of arms, for I showed them swords, and they took them by the blade and cut themselves through ignorance. They have no iron, their darts being wands without iron, some of them having a fish's tooth at the end, and others being pointed in various ways. They should be good servants and intelligent, for I observed that they quickly took in what was said to them, and I believe that they would easily be made Christians, as it appeared to me that they had no religion. Sunday, October 14. These people are very simple as regards the use of arms, as your highnesses will see from the 7 that I caused to be taken, to bring home and learn our language in return, unless your highnesses should order them all to be brought to Castile, or to be kept as captives on the same island. For with 50 men they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. The Journal of Christopher Columbus, during his first voyage, translated by Clements R. Markham. It was upon these gentle lambs, imbued by the Creator with all the qualities we have mentioned, that from the very first day they clapped eyes on them, the Spanish fell like ravening wolves upon the fold, or like tigers and savage lions who have not eaten meat for days. The pattern established at the outset has remained unchanged to this day, and the Spaniards still do nothing save tear the natives to shreds, murder them and inflict upon them untold misery, suffering and distress, tormenting, harrying and persecuting them mercilessly. When the Spanish first journeyed there, the indigenous population of the island of Hispaniola stood at some 3 million. Today only 200 survive. The island of Cuba, which extends for a distance almost as great as that separating Valladolid from Rome, is now to all intents and purposes uninhabited. And 2 other large, beautiful and fertile islands, Puerto Rico and Jamaica, have been similarly devastated. Not a living soul remains today on any of the islands of the Bahamas, which lie to the north of Hispaniola and Cuba, even though every single one of the 60 or so islands in the group, as well as those known as the Isles of Giants and others in the area, both large and small, is more fertile and more beautiful than the royal gardens in Seville. Bartolomé de las Casas, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. How does Columbus describe the Native Americans? What insights does Las Casas's account provide into life in the Spanish colonies? Why do you think Columbus's diary is so different from Las Casas's book? Link to learning. Read this longer account by Bartolomé de las Casas of the encomienda system, and note the illustrations that accompany it. Consider how the words and text work together to communicate Las Casas's criticism of the system and of abuses by Spanish colonizers in general. The complaints of reformers, including Las Casas, inspired the Black Legend, which claimed the Spanish were particularly cruel imperialists who abused their colonial subjects. Like many historical legends, the Black Legend is rooted in fact. The Spanish often mistreated Native Americans, but writers from Spain's colonial rivals, most notably the English, frequently exaggerated Spanish cruelty to justify their own colonial abuses. Despite their intense rivalries, both the English and the Spanish were guilty of abusing Native Americans. Even reformers like Las Casas, who opposed the worst abuses of Native Americans, were flawed. Las Casas's approach to Native Americans was often paternalistic, and he typically treated non-Europeans as children who would benefit from the benevolent guidance of Europeans rather than as equals. English settlements in North America. The English began their colonization efforts in the Americas nearly a century after the Spanish, motivated by both economic and ideological goals. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth gave Sir Walter Raleigh a charter, a royal document that authorized him to establish a colony in North America. The Protestant queen wanted colonies that would act as an ideological counterweight to Spanish Catholicism in the Americas and provide a base of operations for privateering expeditions that would raid Spanish shipping. Roanoke Island. In July 1587, about 150 settlers led by explorer and artist John White established a colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of modern North Carolina. The colonists baptized Manteo, a friendly member of the Croatoan tribe, and named him the Lord of Roanoke in an effort to build congenial relationships with the local Native Americans. In late August, White left for England with plans to gather additional investors to fund the colony. Once there, he convinced English merchants to invest in the colony in exchange for trading rights, but the arrival of the Spanish Armada in 1588 delayed his departure. When White finally returned to Roanoke Island in 1590, the colony was gone. The only clue White found was the word Croatoan carved into a tree. There are clear signs the settlers intermarried with the Native American population and joined their society, but Europeans of the era dismissed this possibility. Figure 6. 6. Perhaps because they found it impossible to believe Europeans would willingly join a non-white society. It is also possible the word had nothing to do with the colony's disappearance. John White was forced to leave before completing a thorough investigation. Today, Roanoke Island is known as the Lost Colony, and its fate remains a mystery. A black and white drawing shows men standing in front of a tree on a grassy field. A tall wooden fence runs behind the tree and the men. 4 men stand in the forefront, one with his back showing. They wear helmets, hats, coats, pants, and have mustaches and beards. They hold sticks, and one man points to the word Croatoan carved in a tree. 6 men in the far background stand looking down at a map, and one man kneels in front of them. They are dressed in hats, coats, and pants. Figure 6. 6. The Lost Colony of Roanoke. In this engraving from a 19th century history of the United States, John White discovers the single word Croatoan carved in a tree on Roanoke Island in 1590. It was the only clue found after the disappearance of the colonists. Credit: Croatoan by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Jamestown. The creation of joint stock companies provided English colonial efforts after Roanoke Island with improved funding that the English monarchy could not offer. A joint stock company, much like a modern corporation, raised money for its ventures by selling shares to investors. The company then used the pooled funds to conduct operations, including colonization efforts in the Americas. Shareholders were not legally liable for the actions of the company and could not lose more than the amount of their investment, but they could earn large profits if the joint stock company were successful. The combination of limited liability with the possibility of rich returns made joint stock companies an appealing investment for members of England's growing merchant class, and the companies raised huge sums of money beginning in the early 1600s. England promoted colonization for religious and political reasons, but its reliance on private investors for funding often steered the effort toward profitable activities. In 1606, the Virginia Company, a joint stock company named for Queen Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married, received a charter and sent 144 men and boys to North America. In 1607, these colonists founded Jamestown, named for the new English king, James I, on the banks of the Chesapeake Bay in what is now Virginia. Many of the settlers were the desperate younger sons of elite families who would not inherit property claimed by their older brothers in England. Many others were artisans, including goldsmiths and jewelers, unused to the hard physical labor that building a colony on a new continent required. The settlers of Jamestown, like many Europeans of the 1600s and 1700s, rooted their economic ideas in mercantilism, an economic theory in which the world's wealth, as measured in gold and silver, is assumed to be finite, so a gain of wealth for one nation is a loss for another. Mercantilist nations expected their colonies to export raw materials, most importantly precious metals like gold and silver, back to the home country and to purchase goods from it in turn. The English government hoped the Virginia Company would find gold to improve the nation's trade balances and increase its wealth. Many in Jamestown also hoped to find gold and thereby get rich without having to work hard or suffer any hardships. The Jamestown settlers did not find gold because there was little mineral wealth in the region, but they did find suffering due to bad weather, starvation, disease, internal political disputes, and military conflicts with the Powhatan tribe, named after its chief. The Powhatans grew to loathe the newcomers for bringing disease and violence to their homeland. Many colonists died during the winter of 1609-1610, known as the Starving Time. By May 1610, fewer than 100 remained, and the colony, which had not produced a profit for the Virginia Company, almost failed. Early Virginia colonists did find wealth and success in tobacco cultivation, however, despite the need for hard work in difficult conditions. By 1614, Jamestown began exporting tobacco to Europe and earning profits for the Virginia Company. Smoking the highly addictive dried leaves of the plant became a popular habit in Europe. Like their rivals, the Spanish, English colonists struggled to produce agricultural goods using only their own labor. Instead, they relied heavily on indentured servants, European immigrants who typically agreed to work 4 to 7 years in exchange for transportation to the colony and the hope of a new life there after completing their service. Up to 100,000 people, mostly poor men in their 20s, traveled to the English colonies as indentured servants in the 1600s. Many died of disease, exposure, and overwork, but those who survived their term of service often became reasonably comfortable and respected members of the growing settlements. A fortunate few even became wealthy planters. In 1619, the first Africans arrived in Virginia. Initially, they enjoyed the same opportunities to earn their freedom and build wealth as immigrants from Europe, but their condition quickly deteriorated. They were part of a trend that began with the importation of the first Africans into the Americas by the Spanish and Portuguese a century earlier. By the middle of the 1600s, policies were beginning to develop in the Americas that bound Africans to servitude for life. Unlike European indentured servants who regained their freedom once they had completed their term of service, European colonists in Virginia, like those in Mexico, South America, and the Caribbean, sought ways to maintain a permanent labor force, especially when it proved difficult to recruit sufficient indentured servants from Europe. Attempts to coerce the labor of fellow Europeans would have met with too much resistance. Faced with a growing underclass of embittered poor white former servants, who in 1676 sought to overthrow the colony's government, Virginia's elite sought to solve their problems by drawing legal distinctions between people of European and African ancestry. They extended privileges to whites that were denied to blacks and encouraged European settlers to perceive Africans as inferior people fit only for manual labor, while simultaneously depriving Africans of their freedom. In this way, slavery became associated with African ancestry, and racial divisions were created that had not existed before. Racism became the basis on which the colonial labor system was built. In 1680, the Virginia legislature passed an act for preventing Negroes' insurrections that forbid enslaved Africans from carrying weapons, gathering in public, and traveling without permission. Enslaved Africans became the most important source of coerced labor in Virginia, as well as the other English colonies established in the southern part of what became the United States, stretching from Maryland. The colony founded as a haven for English Catholics just north of Virginia, to Georgia. This enslavement in the United States ended only in 1865, after a devastating civil war, and the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Slavery continued in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, with Brazil not abolishing it until 1888. New England. In 1620, Puritan separatists led by William Bradford left Plymouth, England, on the Mayflower, and founded a colony they called Plymouth near what is now Boston, Massachusetts. The separatists wanted to leave England to escape the Church of England, which they felt was corrupt, and whose interpretation of Scripture the separatists considered lax. Before landing, their leaders signed the Mayflower Compact, a document that emphasized their desire to found a colony for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our king and country. More than just a religious document, the Mayflower Compact also had a major political impact with its support of direct democracy and of building governments that reflected the will of the people. Like the English settlers far to the south in Virginia, the separatists struggled to survive in their new homes. Roughly half died of starvation, disease, malnutrition, and cold during the difficult winter of 1620–1621. Many of the survivors became too weak to work, and soon the entire colony was dependent on the 7 who were healthy enough to do so. Political disputes broke out, and the first English colony in New England almost died. Just when Plymouth seemed doomed, Native Americans decided to help. They included Samoset, a member of the Abenaki tribe who had been living with the Wampanoag tribe, and Tisquantum, Squanto, of the Pawtuxet tribe, who had learned to speak some English from fishers who visited the coast before the separatists arrived. Tisquantum had been kidnapped by English explorer Thomas Hunt and sold into slavery in Spain, but had managed to escape to England. There, he joined the Newfoundland Company, another English joint stock company, and had returned to North America in 1619. Samoset, Tisquantum, and other friendly Native Americans helped the English negotiate treaties with nearby tribes and taught them to grow corn, which became the colony's main food source. But a relationship that may have begun as a friendly attempt to help starving strangers quickly shifted to conflict as the colonizers began seizing indigenous lands. A larger group of Puritans followed in 1630 and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their leader John Winthrop gave a speech titled "A Model of Christian Charity," which expressed his hopes that the Puritan community in the Americas would embrace the twin goals of building economic prosperity and founding a city upon a hill that would serve as a shining example of an ideal Christian community to the entire world. The Puritan colonies were also scenes of religious conflict from which dissenters like Anne Hutchinson, who questioned the all-male church leadership, and Roger Williams, who championed religious toleration, were exiled. The Massachusetts Bay Colony's darkest moment may have come during the 1692 Salem witch trials, when Puritan leaders executed 19 people for witchcraft. Despite such conflicts, the Puritan colonies eventually became self-sustaining communities that mostly achieved their twin objectives of promoting Puritan religious ideology and building a strong economy. Puritan settlers hoped a strong economy would allow their colony to flourish, attract new settlers, and provide evidence of God's favor. Like many Europeans of the 1600s and 1700s, they rooted their economic ideas in mercantilism. The desire to build economic wealth was the primary motive in many colonial ventures, such as Jamestown in Virginia, and provided a secondary motivation in more ideologically driven communities like those set up by the Puritans. Figure 6. 7. A map is shown of the southeastern coast of Canada and the eastern coast of the United States. An area in Canada from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to the St. Lawrence River in the west, from Penobscot in the north, heading south through Abenaki and Kennebec in Canada, down through Narragansett and Pequot in the U.S. is highlighted yellow, indicating English colonies. A small piece next to Mohawk, Oneida is also highlighted yellow. Locations labeled in this area from north to south are New Hampshire 1623, Plymouth 1620-1691, Rhode Island 1636-1643, Connecticut 1636-1639, and New Haven 1636-1664. In the Atlantic Ocean to the east, the map is labeled Massachusetts Bay 1629-1630. Another yellow area runs from just east of the Great Lakes south to Georgia, east to the Atlantic Ocean, and west to the Lower Cherokee. It is labeled from north to south. New Netherlands 1624, New Sweden 1638, Pennsylvania 1681, Maryland 1634, Virginia 1606-1607, Carolina 1663, and Georgia 1732. Locations in this area include Jamestown 1608, Roanoke 1586-1588, Catawba, Yamasee, and Lower Cherokee. The rest of the map is not highlighted with these areas labeled from north to south. Quebec 1608, Huron, Ottawa, Onondaga, Cayuga, Ottawa twice, Seneca, Iroquois, Tuscarora, Delaware, Western Delaware, Shawnee, Upper Cherokee, Middle Cherokee, Upper Natchez, Lower Natchez, and Creek. New France 1534 is in the north next to Huron, and Florida 1513 is in the south next to Creek. Figure 6, 7 English settlements. This map shows English colonies and key settlements in North America in the 1600s, as well as the neighboring territories inhabited by Native American tribes at the time. Many more tribes inhabited this region than the few whose names appear on the map. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. French and Dutch settlements. In 1609, Dutch merchants hired Henry Hudson, an English sea captain, to lead an expedition into the Atlantic Ocean. The Dutch hoped Hudson would find the long-sought Northwest Passage, a mythical water route thought to allow ships from Europe to sail west through the North American continent, cross the Pacific Ocean, and arrive in Asia. Hudson discovered a deep-water port, now known as New York Harbor, and a large river, now known as the Hudson, that led inland. For a moment it appeared he had found the Northwest Passage. However, the Hudson River became too shallow for ocean-going ships near present-day Albany, New York, and the expedition turned back. Hudson did not find the Northwest Passage, but he did find a valuable port and rich river valley that he claimed for the Dutch. After Hudson returned to Europe, the Dutch West India Company, a joint stock company much like the Virginia Company, made plans to set up a small colony in North America. In contrast to the settled agricultural model preferred by English colonists, the Dutch focused on trade. Company directors hoped their colony would improve their access to the North American fur trade, ensure their control of the valuable port, eventually known as New York Harbor, and solidify their claim on the area, which they suspected might contain additional sources of wealth they had not yet discovered. In 1624, 30 families aboard the ship Nieuw Nederland arrived in what is now New York and founded the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. They came for many reasons, but many hoped to become rich by working in the fur trade. The Dutch, like their Spanish and English colonial rivals, struggled to produce goods using paid labor and sought to remedy the problem with the importation of enslaved Africans. They also encouraged immigration from across Europe with promises of economic opportunities and some level of religious toleration that extended even to Jewish people, who faced severe discrimination in most of Europe. New Netherlands soon became a prosperous colony populated by people from across Europe and Africa. Colonists lived in a band of farms and towns stretching along the Hudson River Valley from New Amsterdam, which is now New York City, north to the village of Beverwijk, now Albany. They engaged in some farming, but they mostly relied on the fur trade for their income. Beyond the book. New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam was founded by the Dutch in 1624, at the southern tip of the island now known as Manhattan. The city quickly became a thriving center of trade and commerce. In 1664, an English military expedition captured the city and renamed it New York, figure 6. 8. A painting shows the view of a settlement from the water, with the sky in the background. In the forefront, a large four-masted ship with drab, white sails and a brown hull sits in the water with smoke billowing from a cannon. A smaller one-masted ship with drab white sails and a brown hull sits at the left, and 3 boats with people in them are at the right, with 3 smaller ships shown close to shore. On shore in the middle, a tall, thin wooden structure is seen next to a small wooden house. Behind that, red, white, and brown houses of various sizes line the shore, with a taller blue and white triangle-roofed building in the left background. A tall windmill is to its left. Green grass and brown sand is shown in the landscape. The words Neo Amsterdam oft nu Neo Iorks op Talent Man are across the top of the painting. Figure 6-8 New Amsterdam. This painting of early New Amsterdam, which later became New York City, was made in 1664 by the Dutch artist and cartographer Johannes Vingboons. Credit: Gezicht op Neo Amsterdam by Jehugen van Nederland / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. How is New Amsterdam depicted in this picture? What parts of the picture would have seemed familiar to people in the Netherlands? Do you think this painting is an accurate depiction of life in 17th century New Amsterdam? Why do you think the European artist chose to portray the city in this fashion? New Netherlands became a scene of increasing conflict as the colony grew. Initially, the Dutch enjoyed friendly relationships with Native Americans eager to trade their furs for European firearms, metal tools, and wool blankets. Serious disputes began, however, when the Dutch demanded payment for the benefits they believed they had brought, including knowledge of the Christian faith and connection to global markets. Native Americans refused to pay, and violence broke out. To protect New Amsterdam from attack, the Dutch forced enslaved Africans to build fortifications along what was then the city's northeast boundary. The street that ran along these fortifications was known as Wall Street. It later became a major economic center and the home of the New York Stock Exchange. Despite intense warfare, Native Americans were unable to expel the Dutch, who faced a far more dangerous threat from the English. In 1664, an English military expedition arrived in New Amsterdam as part of a broader conflict between England and the Netherlands. With little hope of defending themselves from the English warships, the Dutch surrendered. The English gave them generous peace terms and renamed New Amsterdam, New York, in honor of the Duke of York who had organized the expedition, figure 6-9. A map is shown of the southeastern coast of Canada and the eastern coast of the United States. A thin area in Canada, from the Atlantic Ocean on the east heading along the St. Lawrence River, extending to the west along the north and south of Lake Huron and Lake Superior, is highlighted green, indicating French colonies. Labeled within this green area from east to west are Quebec 1608, Montreal 1642, New France 1534, Huron, Ottawa, Seneca, Ottawa, and Great Lakes. An area highlighted pink that indicates Dutch colonies extends from just south of the St. Lawrence River in an oval shape south to the Atlantic Ocean. It is labeled from the north to the south with Mohawk Oneida, New Netherlands 1624, New Amsterdam 1624, and New Sweden 1638. The rest of the map is gray with these areas labeled from north to south. Penobscot, Abenaki, Kennebec, New Hampshire 1623, Narragansett, Onondaga, Cayuga, Plymouth 1620, Pequot, Rhode Island 1636-1643, Connecticut 1636-1639, New Haven 1636-1664, Iroquois, Tuscarora, Delaware, Western Delaware, Pennsylvania 1681, Maryland 1634, Shawnee, Virginia 1606-1607, Upper Cherokee, Middle Cherokee, Catawba, Yamasee, Carolina 1663, Lower Cherokee, Upper Natchez, Lower Natchez, Georgia 1732, Creek, and Florida 1513. At the top of the map, the water to the east of New Hampshire 1623 is labeled Massachusetts Bay 1629-1630. Figure 6-9 Dutch and French settlements. This map shows the location of Dutch and French colonies in North America in the 17th century and the tribal lands of Native Americans at the time of European conquest and resettlement. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. The French became aware of colonization opportunities in North America in 1534, when Jacques Cartier voyaged to the area now known as the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada, but they did not rush to set up any colonies. Several early colonization efforts in what is now Canada struggled, mostly due to the harsh northern environment. In 1608, an expedition led by Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, the first major French settlement in North America. The Company of New France, a joint stock company much like the Virginia Company and the Dutch West India Company, led the early French colonization efforts in North America and helped fund settlements. New France was a collection of French settlements begun in 1534 in what is now Newfoundland. It eventually included much of North America, including Canada and the Mississippi River Valley, all the way to southern Louisiana on the Gulf of Mexico. Like the Dutch, French colonizers focused on trade rather than the settled agricultural model preferred by the English. They earned most of their profits from the lucrative fur market and engaged in fishing off the coast of what is now Canada. Among the French settlers were a small number of French Catholic priests who attempted to convert Native Americans to Christianity, as the Spanish had done in their colonies. Most of these missionaries were members of the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, a religious organization dedicated to spreading Catholicism and opposing Protestantism. The Jesuits practiced cultural accommodation, a method of integrating a culture into the dominant society without forcing it to fully integrate and adopt all the dominant culture's components. They just wanted Native Americans to become Catholics and did not care whether they adopted any other aspect of European culture. The Jesuits in Canada also likely realized that they had neither sufficient numbers nor the support from France that would have been necessary to force indigenous peoples to submit to attempts to change their way of life. The French probably enjoyed the friendliest relationships with Native Americans of any European colonizers. Unlike their rivals, they usually attempted to solve the shortage of labor by allying themselves with Native Americans. The French sought wealth in furs and the assistance of Native American tribes who knew the land much better than did the European newcomers, was needed to best exploit this valuable resource. Also, because few French women came to New France, many French colonists married Native American women, leading to the creation of a multicultural and multiracial society. In 1627, Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to King Louis XIII, provided a spiritual justification for Franco-Indian partnerships in the Ordinance of 1627. The ordinance read in part, "The descendants of the French who are accustomed to this country, New France, together with all the Indians who will be brought to the knowledge of the faith and will profess it, shall be deemed and renowned natural Frenchmen, and as such may come to live in France when they want, and acquire, donate, and succeed and accept donations and legacies, just as true French subjects, without being required to take letters of declaration of naturalization." Not all Native Americans wanted to give up their traditional beliefs or become French, but the ordinance was an important gesture that the French government was willing to accept them as equal members of society. It helped the French build strong relationships with Native Americans, particularly the Algonquin-speaking tribes that populated most of New France. The French further reinforced their alliance with the Algonquins by providing them with weapons, which they used in their wars with rival Iroquoian-speaking tribes and with Dutch and English settlers. Even when indigenous peoples profited from their relationship with European colonists, however, they might still suffer negative consequences. The introduction of guns, for example, made Native American warfare more deadly. As the Iroquois, who were armed by the Dutch, waged war with the French-allied Wendat nation, their European trading partners profited from the trade in stolen pelts. The use of guns and the incentives offered for killing as many animals as possible had environmental implications as well, because it depleted beaver and deer populations in some areas. The hunger for European manufactured goods encouraged some Native Americans to go into debt to European traders, while the reduction of animal populations left some without the means to pay. Many indigenous people also became addicted to the alcohol sold or traded by Europeans. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how the 7 Years' War established a new balance of power in Europe, discuss the causes and effects of Britain's colonization of India, analyze the ways in which the Qing dynasty developed and maintained a favorable balance of trade with Europe, describe how colonized societies responded to the expansion of European empires. In the mid-1700s, the British Empire grew from a minor player on the world stage to a dominant superpower. Trade that flowed through and from the British North American colonies made many British business and political leaders rich. Victory in the 7 Years' War consolidated their power over European rivals. In hopes of further increasing their political and economic power, many supported further expansion of the empire into new areas. Britain therefore expanded its colonies in India and turned its eyes to China. The 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War 1756–1763 was a global conflict that began as a fight for dominance between European powers, primarily Great Britain and France, but it quickly involved groups from India, Africa, and the Americas. Figure 6. 10. Conflicts that overlapped with the 7 Years' War were the French and Indian War in North America and the Third Carnatic War in India. A map of the world is shown. The continents of North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia are labeled. Areas highlighted green indicating the Spanish Empire are the central third of the United States and the very southeastern portion including Florida, all of Central America, including Mexico, the northwestern portion of South America, the western coast of South America, including Peru, and a small area extending east to the Atlantic Ocean toward the south, Spain, and the northern portion of the Philippines. Areas highlighted purple indicating the Portuguese Empire are a U-shaped area on the east coast of South America, Portugal, the the southern portion of the Philippines, and a small sliver on the southeastern coast of Africa across from Madagascar. Areas highlighted orange indicating the British Empire are a U-shaped area south of the Hudson Bay in Canada, a thin strip running from east to west in southeastern Canada, a U-shaped area in the United States running from Maine south to Georgia and back up to the Great Lakes, Great Britain, and a small triangle-shaped area in eastern India. Areas highlighted yellow indicating the Russian Empire are all of Russia, islands north of Japan, a small island north of the Philippines, and the western portion of Alaska. Areas highlighted red indicating the Dutch Empire are the western portion of Guyana in South America, the Netherlands, a small section at Africa's southern tip, a small northern portion of Madagascar, the island of Ceylon, and the Dutch East Indies. Areas highlighted dark blue indicating the Ottoman Empire are the southern, eastern, and northeastern coasts of the Mediterranean Sea, extending southeast along the Arabian Peninsula on the east side of the Red Sea, and a very thin rectangular strip on the southwest portion of Africa along the Atlantic Ocean. Areas highlighted light blue indicating the French Empire are an oval area around the Great Lakes in North America extending around the St. Lawrence River into Canada, the eastern portion of Guyana in South America, and France. A dashed line indicates conflict zones. These areas are an oval area in southeastern Canada and the eastern portion of North America, an oval area in Europe which includes Poland, Austria, Hungary, and the westernmost edge of Russia, and an oval area that encompasses the lower two-thirds of India and the northern portion of Ceylon. Figure 6.10 The 7 Years' War. This map shows a global view of the 7 Years' War, which began in 1756. Note the many participants and the far-flung conflict zones. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, New France grew steadily. In 1663, King Louis XIV canceled the royal charter with the Company of New France and transformed the settlement into a royal colony. French merchants and priests gradually expanded their reach from Quebec through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River, founding New Orleans near the Gulf of Mexico in 1718. The English proved a serious obstacle for the growth of New France, however. Wealthy farmers in the English colonies of North America wanted to expand into the Ohio River Valley, territory claimed by France and its Native American allies. In 1754, violence broke out between French soldiers and members of the Virginia militia near what is now Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Initially, the French and their Native American allies performed well, launching skillful ambushes on English troops and forcing George Washington, a young officer in the Virginia colonial militia, to surrender Britain's Fort Necessity. In their own words, George Washington on the French and Indian War. George Washington wrote to his mother on July 18, 1755, when he was 23 years old and fighting in the French and Indian War. His letter, excerpted here, describes the battle near Fort Duquesne, now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. British soldiers and members of the Virginia militia met a surprise attack by French and Indian fighters and were defeated. Honored Madam, as I doubt not but you have heard of our defeat, and perhaps have had it represented in a worse light, if possible, than it deserves. I have taken this earliest opportunity to give you some account of the engagement, as it happened within 7 miles of the French fort, on Wednesday the 9th instant. We marched onto that place without any considerable loss, having only now and then a straggler picked up by the French scouting Indians. When we came there, we were attacked by a body of French and Indians, whose number, I am persuaded, did not exceed 300 men. Ours consisted of about 1,300 well-armed troops, chiefly regular soldiers, who were struck with such a panic that they behaved with more cowardice than it is possible to conceive. The officers behaved gallantly in order to encourage their men, for which they suffered greatly, there being near 60 killed and wounded, a large proportion of the number we had. The Virginia troops showed a good deal of bravery and were near all killed, for I believe, out of 3 companies that were there is scarce 30 men left alive. In short, the dastardly behavior of those they call regulars exposed all others that were inclined to do their duty to almost certain death. And at last, in despite of all the efforts of the officers to the contrary, they broke and run as sheep pursued by dogs, and it was impossible to rally them. I luckily escaped without a wound, though I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me. Captains Orme and Morris were wounded early. I was the only person then left to distribute the general's orders, which I was scarcely able to do, as I was not half recovered from a violent illness that had confined me to my bed and a wagon for above 10 days. I am still in a weak and feeble condition, which induces me to halt here 2 or 3 days in hopes of recovering a little strength, to enable me to proceed homewards. I am, honored madam, your most dutiful son, George Washington. Letter to Mary Ball Washington, July 18, 1755. Why does Washington want to explain to his mother what happened during the battle? What is Washington's opinion of the regular British soldiers, British officers, and Virginia militia in the battle? What obstacles did Washington face during the battle? However, the early success of the French in forcing the British to retreat did not last. In 1758, the Shawnee tribe, the Delaware tribe, and the powerful Iroquoian Confederacy agreed to ally with the English in exchange for their promise to respect indigenous rights to contested lands on the frontier. The Iroquois Confederacy was a collection of allied Native American tribes who called themselves Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse. The name referred both to the rectangular homes in which they lived and their geographic territory, which extended from what is now Vermont in the east all the way to Lake Erie in the west, an area roughly the shape of a longhouse. The Iroquoian tribes had formed a military and economic alliance by 1600 that consisted of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca tribes. The Tuscarora tribe joined the Confederacy in 1722. Other, non-Iroquoian Native Americans, including several Algonquin tribes, remained loyal to the French until the end of the war in 1763. With Native American help, the English launched successful offensives against New France. The British turned in the tide in 1759, with a series of victories culminating in their capture of French Quebec after the battle on the Plains of Abraham, Figure 6. 11. A map of the eastern portion of the United States and the Atlantic Ocean is shown, entitled The French and Indian War 1754-1763. Areas highlighted purple indicating British are Nova Scotia in Canada, an unmarked island north of Nova Scotia, the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Areas highlighted pink indicating French are all of the area in Canada shown, labeled New France, as well as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and lands shown to the west. Florida is highlighted green indicating the Spanish. Areas highlighted yellow indicating the disputed areas are Maine, a thin strip of land along the southern part of Canada along Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and the unlabeled lands to the west. Blue dashed arrows indicating British forces are shown heading from New Jersey north through the Atlantic up to Ft. Louisburg, and then on from there to Quebec. They are also shown with blue dashed arrows heading from New Jersey to Ft. Duquesne from Maryland to Ft. Duquesne from Delaware to Ft. Necessity and from southern New York west to Ft. Frontenac and then east toward Lake Champlain. Red dotted arrows indicating French forces are shown heading from Lake Champlain to Ft. William Henry and to Ft. Oswego. A black X is shown indicating forts. The forts listed from the north to the south are Ft. Louisburg 1758, Ft. Beausejour 1755, Ft. Ticonderoga 1758, Ft. William Henry, Ft. Stanwix, Ft. Frontenac 1758, Ft. Oswego, Ft. Niagara 1759, Ft. Duquesne, and Ft. Necessity 1754. Black asterisks are shown indicating important battles at Quebec 1759, Ft. Louisburg 1758, and an area in northern New York. Purple boxes indicate British win battle at Quebec 1759, Ft. Louisburg 1758, Ft. Frontenac 1758, and Ft. Niagara 1759. Red boxes indicate French win battle at Ft. Ticonderoga 1758, Ft. William Henry, Braddock's defeat 1756 at Ft. Duquesne and Ft. Necessity 1754. Figure 6:11 Key battles. This map shows the key battles of the French and Indian War, 1754-1763, including Britain's loss at Fort Duquesne, where George Washington fought, and its decisive victory in Quebec. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. The French and Indian War ended with the victory of Great Britain and Prussia over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War, and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in February 1763. Under the treaty, the French government surrendered all its territory in North America, as well as outposts in the Caribbean, India, and Africa. Britain became the undisputed controller of eastern North America, from Canada in the north to the Florida border in the south, and from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west. The 7 Years' War had begun in Europe in 1756 when Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Saxony and annexed the area as part of his broader plan to expand Prussian territory. In response, France, Spain, and Russia joined forces with Austria to oppose him. Great Britain allied itself with Prussia to maintain the balance of power in Europe, a situation in which competing nations have approximately equal military power. Maintaining this balance was a key feature of British foreign policy, meant to prevent the domination of Europe by any one nation. Military alliances thus transformed what could have been a small border dispute in Europe into a major war that quickly spread around the world. Figure 6:12. A map shows Europe and a portion of Russia. The Baltic Sea, the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the Bay of Biscay, the Strait of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Adriatic Sea, the Ionian Sea, the Aegean Sea, the Sea of Marmara, and the Black Sea are labeled. 2 colors are shown indicating which countries allied with each other. Areas highlighted green include Great Britain, Portugal, Prussia, and Hanover, indicating allies. Great Britain, Portugal, Prussia, Hanover. Areas highlighted orange include Spain, France, Austria, Sweden, Saxony, and Russia, indicating allies. Spain, France, Austria, Sweden, Saxony, Russia. All other areas are not highlighted. Figure 6:12 Allies in Europe. This map shows the many alliances made in Europe during the 7 Years' War. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. In 1758, a British expeditionary force captured the French outpost of Senegal in West Africa, and other French outposts were taken during a series of subsequent offensives. The loss of valuable trading ports damaged the French economy at the very moment France desperately needed money to fund the war effort. More importantly, it deprived French military forces of strategic bases they could have used to raid British shipping and resupply their warships. In Asia, the British East India Company, a joint stock company founded in 1600 with the original goal of trading in the Indian Ocean, was by now providing the British with a much stronger economic as well as military and diplomatic foundation than their French rivals had. To thwart these British advantages and gain control of valuable territory in India, the French formed an alliance with the Mughal Empire. At its height, this powerful Muslim realm had once ruled more than 150 million people living across 1.5 million square miles in what is now Afghanistan, India, and Bangladesh. The British defeated the French forces in 1761. However, when they captured Pondicherry, the most important French outpost in India, the Mughals continued to resist British domination even after the French had largely withdrawn from India. In 1762, the British launched attacks on Spanish colonies in Asia and the Caribbean, capturing the port of Manila in the Philippines and occupying it until the end of the war in 1763. They were less successful in expanding their control over the islands, despite the assistance of indigenous Filipinos who disliked Spanish rule. In the Caribbean, however, Britain succeeded in capturing Havana, Cuba, one of the most important ports in the Western Hemisphere, and held it until the end of the conflict. Furthermore, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the French surrendered their imperial possessions in North America and India to the British, while the Spanish surrendered Florida to the British and France gave control of the Louisiana Territory to Spain. The subsequent Peace of Hubertusburg guaranteed Prussian control of Silesia, an area in Central Europe, and confirmed Prussia's status as a major force in Europe. The British, for their part, emerged from the 7 Years' War as the world's leading economic, military, and political power. British influence in India. After their victory in the 7 Years' War, the British focused on expanding their control in India. In 1757, the forces of the British East India Company led by Robert Clive defeated the ruler of Bengal, a region in northeast India, who had favored the French. The British East India Company's victory left it in control of territory larger than the island of Britain itself. 4 years later, the capture of Pondicherry by the British effectively removed the French from contention in the competition to dominate Indian trade. After 1761, the indigenous peoples of India provided the only significant source of resistance. In 1764, British and Indian forces under the command of the British East India Company defeated a much larger army led by the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II at Buxar. After Buxar, the Mughals retained control of territory in northern and western India, but effectively surrendered governance of much of southern and eastern India to the British East India Company. This included awarding the British East India Company the right to collect taxes in Bengal in 1765. The immense wealth gained from tax collection enabled the company to further dominate India. Forces under the leadership of the company defeated the Kingdom of Mysore in southern India by 1799 and the Central Indian Maratha Empire by 1818, figure 613. 2 maps of India are shown. Map A is labeled 1765. British East India Company control is highlighted blue. This includes a square-shaped region in East India and a small, thin, rectangular region along the coast in the middle of eastern India. Hindu control is highlighted green and includes 2 small oval areas in the north, a triangular area in the east, a large area in the middle of India, and a very small, thin sliver at the southern tip of India. Muslim control is highlighted orange and includes an upside-down V shape in the north, a minute oval area in the middle, and an hourglass shape in the south of India. Map B is labeled 1805. British East India Company control is highlighted blue. This includes a square-shaped region in East India, which extends west in a thin area toward the north, as well as a long, thin rectangular region along the coast, starting in the middle of the country, extending down to the southern tip. Hindu control is highlighted green and includes a large upside-down V shape throughout most of the country, a triangular area in the east, and a very small, thin oval area at the southern tip of India. Muslim control is highlighted orange and includes a thin, long area in the northwest, a square shape in the north, a minute oval area in the middle, and an oval shape in the south of India. Figure 6. 13 Britain's growing control in India. These maps of India show, in blue, the area dominated by the British East India Company in 1765, A, and the even larger area it controlled in 1805, B. Attribution and B. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. Britain and the British East India Company both benefited economically from their colonial control of India. When investors founded the company in 1600, they initially focused on trading in spices. As spices decreased in price and profit, however, the company turned its attention to textiles produced by highly skilled Indian artisans. Finally, when the value of hand-woven fabric began decreasing in the early 19th century, the company pivoted to trading Indian-produced opium for Chinese-grown tea, which became an increasingly valuable consumer good in the late 18th century. The British East India Company typically engaged in indirect rule, a system in which colonial powers cooperated with indigenous elites and allowed local leaders to exercise some authority. In exchange for British support of their power, Indian elites upheld the company's foreign and economic policies. Most importantly, they ensured a steady flow of taxes and soldiers from the indigenous people to the British East India Company. Indian soldiers, called sepoys, who were often led by British officers, defended British territory in India and enforced British laws, figure 614. A painting shows a dark-skinned and barefoot man and woman standing on a blue floor with green grasses on a white field behind and blue clouds above. The woman on the left wears a white cloth with red trim wrapped around her body, with her arms and part of her stomach exposed, her black hair up in a side bun, and jewelry around her neck and on her head. Her left arm is extended out to the man. He wears a red military coat with black and white trim, white tassels on his shoulders, short white pants with black and white trim, and a black hat with gold trim. He has a black mustache and is carrying a musket rifle. Figure 6. 14 A sepoy and his wife. A Hindu sepoy of the Madras Native Infantry and his wife, shown in a watercolor painting made on paper by an unknown army artist in about 1810. Credit, Sepoy of Madras Native Infantry and his wife, by National Army Museum / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The system of indirect rule often worked within existing power structures, providing British support for elites that had already long ruled India. However, in areas where indigenous rulers opposed colonization, the British disrupted traditional practices, removed elites who refused to cooperate, and administered those areas directly. British rule led to conflicts within Indian society, with many indigenous communities divided between people who wanted to cooperate with the British and those who supported a series of rebellions against foreign domination. Indians who opposed the British were further divided between those who supported violent resistance and those who believed peaceful resistance was more promising. In 1813, as a result of pressure exerted by religious interests on the British Parliament, the British East India Company allowed missionaries limited access to India. This was a reversal of the company's long-standing policy of banning Christian missionaries, for fear their activities would lead to unrest that would disrupt trade. The new policy pleased nobody and led to an unlikely alliance among British Christians and Indian Muslims and Hindus, who agreed on very little other than that the British East India Company should not rule India. British Christians opposed the East India Company's rule because of its stance on missionary activity. Indian Muslims and Hindus opposed the company's rule because they wished to govern themselves. China's dominance in trade. China had long been a major world power and became even stronger with the rise of the Qing, 1644–1912, the last imperial dynasty. After defeating their Ming predecessors and consolidating their power, Qing rulers turned to rebuilding the Chinese economy. With a stable frontier, they were able to reduce military spending and lower tax burdens, which freed money for people to invest in businesses and for the wealthier classes to purchase luxuries. The Qing seized land from wealthy families that supported their political rivals and distributed it to other families that set up small farms. To help these new farms, the government gave the owners draft animals, tools, and seeds. Most farmers focused on growing rice in the river valleys, but the introduction of potatoes from the Americas allowed them to grow food on hilly ground that had never been widely cultivated before. Some began growing tobacco, which also came from the Americas and became a key cash crop for Chinese farmers. To facilitate economic development, the Qing upgraded China's infrastructure, including rebuilding roads and improving the Grand Canal. Begun in the 5th century BCE and still in use today, this waterway stretches 1,100 miles from Beijing in the north to Hangzhou in the south. It is the world's longest canal and connects several important waterways, including the Huang, Yellow, Huai, and Yangtze rivers, figure 615. In the Qing era, the Grand Canal transported luxuries, but most importantly it brought food from the rich agricultural river valleys of the south to the large cities of northern China such as Beijing, which became major centers of commerce and manufacturing during this time. A map of an eastern portion of China is shown with the Bohai Sea and the Yellow Sea on the right. A blue line is shown starting from the north in Beijing and ending in the south at Hangzhou, passing through these cities along the way. Tangzhou, Tianjin, Changzhou, Dezhou, Linking, Liacheng, Nanwang, Jining, Nanyang, Peixian, Suzhou, Pizhou, Huyan, Yangzhou, Zhenjiang, Changzhou, Wuxi, Suzhou, and Jiaxing. At Pizhou, the blue line heads north through Taizheng and ends at Hanzhuang. Other cities that are labeled from north to south are Shijiazhuang, Jinan, Qingdao, Nanjing, Hefei, and Shanghai. Figure 615 China's Grand Canal. This map shows the course of the Grand Canal of China as it looks today, stretching about 1,100 miles from Hangzhou in the south all the way to Beijing in the north. Credit. Modification of work, Modern Course of Grand Canal of China, by Ian Q/Wikimedia Commons, CC by 30. The Qing dynasty's leaders also focused on increasing China's international trade. They signed new treaties with foreign nations, including the Treaty of Kayakta, 1727 with Russia, which opened China to new European markets. They also improved trading relationships with Japan, the nations of Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. The Qing government lifted most prohibitions on trade with the Western nations. Under the Canton system, in place from 1759 to 1842, Western Europeans were permitted to trade with China if they agreed to work through the Chinese guilds that enjoyed monopoly rights to the tea and silk trades. Under this system, all trade was confined to the southern Chinese port of Canton, Guangzhou, in order to limit contact with Europeans and foreign influence on China. Only members of the merchant guild authorized to transact business with Westerners were allowed to have contact with Europeans. All Europeans trading in China were subject to Chinese law, and they were required to live and do business in a small area outside the city walls. Europeans were not allowed to bring firearms or warships into the port, and European women were also prohibited from settling in Canton, which prevented a permanent European community from taking root there. The Canton system successfully increased China's trade with Europe and improved the Chinese economy. By 1833, the Chinese were exporting 28 times more tea and welcoming 13 times more foreign ships than before. Tea was the most important export, but China also exported large quantities of silk and porcelain. It rejected most European trade goods and insisted on payment for its exports in silver. Desperate for Chinese goods, Europeans complied, and several $1 million worth of silver flowed into China each year. As a result, China enjoyed a very favorable balance of trade with Europe. This encouraged European nations to find a way to chip away at China's trade advantages. Colonial resistance and revolution. The colonies' role as generators of wealth for their home nations led to the exploitation of both their original inhabitants and their natural resources. As European states sought to expand their colonial dominions in order to play a greater role in the global economy, they encountered resistance from the people whose lands and labor they sought to use. Some of the earliest resistance took place in the Americas. Resistance in the Americas. The indigenous people of New Spain were the first to fight back. The first instance of resistance took place in 1493 with the destruction of Columbus's early colony, called La Navidad, by the indigenous inhabitants of Hispaniola. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola on his second voyage, he discovered that all 39 of the men he had left behind had been killed. Some acts of resistance nearly put an end to Spanish settlement in parts of North America. In 1680, a Tewa Pueblo religious leader named Pape led his tribe along with other Pueblo people, and the Apache tribe in an uprising against Spanish religious, economic, and cultural abuses in New Mexico. 400 Spanish died, and the rest fled the region. 12 years passed before the Spanish returned to the region in significant numbers. The Pueblo revolt ultimately failed to provide Native Americans with permanent independence, but it did shape Spain's colonial policies in the region. Although Spain regained control of the region in 1692, it subsequently granted land to the Pueblos and appointed officials to represent the tribe's rights in Spanish courts. The Pueblos adopted some elements of Spanish culture, including some Christian practices, but Spanish priests did not attempt to destroy the Pueblos' traditional religion as they had before. The Pueblo tribes were thus able to retain much of their way of life, preserving unique cultures that remain today. Link to learning. Native Americans in the United States continue to struggle with the lingering impacts of European colonization, including poverty, discrimination, and infringement on their reservations. Read a statement from lawyers at the Native American Rights Fund about their recent attempts to prevent the construction of a pipeline across Native American territory. Do you think the United States should have approved the Keystone XL project, despite the objection of Native Americans who do not want the project on their land? Do you see a connection between the proposed Keystone project and past practices of European powers? If so, what is it? Link to learning. Resistance among Native Americans in the Southwest continues today. Read this article about the efforts of members of the Navajo tribe to end uranium mining on their tribal lands to learn more. North American tribes in areas claimed by the English also were threatened with the loss of their way of life, especially in the Chesapeake Bay colonies of Virginia and Maryland, where tobacco constituted the main cash crop. Tobacco cultivation quickly drained the soil of nutrients, leading English settlers to push further westward in search of land for new fields. Even where colonists did not grow cash crops, the demand for farmland placed pressure on indigenous communities. Colonists attempted to enslave Native Americans and use their labor to grow tobacco. Sometimes the English captured indigenous people in attacks on their villages, and sometimes Native American tribes sold war captives to them. Before the arrival of Europeans, Native American tribes had often integrated captives from other groups into their own. Now these people might be sold to the English as enslaved laborers. Although the enslavement of Native Americans was most common in English colonies in the South, it occurred in northern colonies as well. The English found themselves in frequent conflict with Native American tribes. Between 1609 and 1646, Virginia colonists fought a series of wars with the Powhatan Confederacy, an alliance of tribes that spoke languages of the Algonquin family. In New England, long-standing complaints by indigenous people about English usurpation of land, dishonest traders who cheated them, attempts to convert them to Christianity, and English officials' refusal to allow them to punish Europeans who had wronged them led to the outbreak of King Philip's War. United in the summer of 1675 by the Wampanoag leader Metacomet, called King Philip by the English, Native American tribes throughout New England attacked English settlements, destroying several and threatening to expel the English from their lands entirely. The English led a counterattack with the help of Native Americans who had converted to Christianity and killed Metacomet's followers. The conflict ended in 1676 when Metacomet II was killed, figure 616. A drawing of a man is on a worn piece of paper with torn edges. He is standing in front of a group of other men, some trees, mountains, and sky. The man in the forefront wears a white V-neck shirt with trim, and a medallion hanging form the V, a beaded thick belt, and a pink cloth to his knees. He wears moccasins, a long cape on his shoulders, and a white cloth on his head. He is holding a tall, thin rifle in one hand, and an axe and elephant tusk lay at his feet. His shadow is seen on the ground. In the left background, 9 men are shown. One bald man in a white cloth is sitting blowing smoke from his mouth. Another bald man wears a blue cloth and holds an axe, while the bald heads of the others are shown in a group at the left. The words Philip King of Mount Hope are displayed across the bottom, figure 6, 16 Metacomet. The Wampanoag leader Metacomet was named Philip by English settlers. Nearly 100 years after his death, he was depicted in this engraving made by Paul Revere to illustrate a 1772 edition of the entertaining history of King Philip's War by Thomas Church. Credit: Philip King of Mount Hope by Paul Revere, by Yale University Art Gallery / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. English colonial leaders displayed Metacomet's severed head in Plymouth as a grisly trophy of their success. To prevent future attacks, captured Wampanoags and others who had allied themselves with Metacomet were enslaved and sent to labor on English sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Between 1715 and 1717, provoked by many of the same issues that had led to conflict in New England, the Yamasee, a confederation of Native American tribes in the Carolinas, also waged war on British colonists. Like Metacomet's followers, the Yamasee were killed or enslaved. The survivors fled the region or joined other tribes. Resistance in Africa. Africa was also subject to European incursions, beginning with the Portuguese in the 15th century. In the 16th century, other Europeans began to arrive. The coastal areas were most likely to be targeted and were particularly vulnerable to imperialist invaders because they were more accessible to advanced warships. As Native Americans had done, Africans resisted European encroachments on their lands and efforts to deprive them of their sovereignty. In the early 1500s, Europeans began enslaving Africans in large numbers as part of the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted until the mid-19th century. European slave traders, like the Arab slave traders before them, typically worked within Africa's existing power structures and purchased enslaved people from rival groups of Africans, in a process that disrupted but did not initially challenge Africans' control of the interior. Many Africans, particularly in the interior, actively resisted foreign influence. One of the longest acts of resistance was led by Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. Nzinga inherited the position of ruler of the Kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now Angola, in 1624 following the death of her brother. She had served as emissary from her brother to the Portuguese and helped end the hostilities between them and her brother's military forces. In 1621, she negotiated an agreement whereby the Portuguese were allowed to engage in the slave trade within Ndongo territory, but not to establish forts there. Nzinga was also adamant that Ndongo would not pay tribute to the Portuguese king. To assure the Portuguese that she negotiated in good faith, she agreed to convert to Roman Catholicism and had the Portuguese governor's wife serve as her godmother. Following Nzinga's ascension to the throne, however, Portugal began to renege on the terms of the treaty, and to insist that the nobles of Ndongo become vassals of the King of Portugal. This would mean sending the Portuguese king the soldiers, enslaved people, and supplies they otherwise owed to Nzinga. In retaliation, Nzinga encouraged enslaved people to escape from the Portuguese. In 1626, Portugal declared war on her. The common people of Ndongo and some of the lesser members of the nobility supported Nzinga, while more powerful nobles, who hoped to benefit from engaging in the slave trade with Portugal, supported the Europeans. Nzinga found allies in the Kingdom of Congo. She was also assisted by Dutch slave traders, with whom she did business. Following the conclusion of a peace treaty between the Dutch and the Portuguese, Nzinga found herself unable to force the Portuguese out of Ndongo territory and dedicated her efforts to preventing them from moving deeper into the African interior. Finally, in 1656, Nzinga concluded a peace treaty with Portugal and hostilities ceased. Other African tribes resisted the incursions of the Dutch. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a settlement at the Cape of Good Hope and traded with the indigenous people of the region, the Khoikhoi, who were hunters and cattle herders. Although the company prohibited the enslavement of the indigenous peoples of the Cape, in order to maintain their willingness to participate in the cattle trade, conflict arose between the settlers and the Khoisan, the name by which the Khoikhoi and another people, the San, are jointly known. Dutch farmers took over indigenous hunting and grazing lands to grow crops and herd their own cattle. The Khoisan responded by burning Dutch farms and stealing their cattle. The Dutch then retaliated by attacking Khoisan settlements. This conflict continued throughout the 18th century. As the Khoisan lost control of their lands to the Dutch, who increasingly expanded inland from the Cape, many found themselves becoming laborers on Dutch farmsteads, either because they could not support themselves after losing their land and cattle or because they were captured by settlers during Dutch raids. In the second half of the 18th century, the Dutch instituted a system of forcing Khoisan children to serve apprenticeships until age 25. Although technically the Khoisan were not enslaved, they had been reduced to a situation very much like slavery. The Dutch also employed enslaved laborers brought from elsewhere in Africa. The movement of the Dutch inland brought them into conflict with the Xhosa people, who were farmers. Although the Dutch possessed more firepower, the Xhosa greatly outnumbered them. The Dutch fought 2 wars with the Xhosa, and from 1799 to 1803 also faced an armed uprising by Khoisan farm laborers, some of whom allied themselves with the Xhosa. As other European empires grew more powerful in the early 19th century, they also began to expand beyond their coastal trading posts in Africa, as the Dutch had done, and became more active in events on the continent, figure 6. 17. In 1806, the British supported the Fanti Confederacy, their African trading partner on what is now the coast of Ghana, in a series of conflicts with the Asante Empire and its Dutch allies. These conflicts culminated in the Anglo-Asante Wars of 1823–1900. The Asante, who hoped to replace Britain as the most powerful nation on the western coast, resisted the British slave trade and Britain's broader pattern of economic imperialism, the practice of dominating a foreign country economically. They succeeded for many years and repeatedly forced the British to retreat to their coastal strongholds. Despite the Asante's initial successes, however, the British and their allies eventually proved more powerful and claimed victory in 1900. The British controlled much of the African west coast until the indigenous people in the region used a combination of non-violent resistance and political pressure to win independence for the nation, now known as Ghana, in 1957. Map A is labeled Colonization in the late 1800s. In the legend, areas highlighted blue indicate independent states. Most of Africa is highlighted blue in this map, with very small portions other colors. Purple indicates British. These areas include 4 triangle-shaped locations along the west coast along the Atlantic and Gulf of Guinea. Green indicates French. These areas include a thin rectangle area in the north by Algeria, a small rectangle area by Senegal, and 3 other small triangle areas along the western coast by the Gulf of Guinea. Pink indicates German. The one area is a square shape located on the western coast by the Gulf of Guinea. Gray indicates Portuguese. These areas include one small triangle shape in the northwestern portion, only long oval section on the lower west coast, and one long oval section on the lower east coast. Yellow indicates Spanish and is one oval area on the northwest part of Africa, north of Senegal. The northeastern coast of Africa is not highlighted. Map B is labeled Colonization in 1914. Blue indicates independent states. These areas include Liberia and Ethiopia. The Belgian Congo is dark pink indicating Belgian. Purple indicates British. These areas include Egypt, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, British East Africa, Northern Nigeria, Gold Coast, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Bechuanaland, Transvaal, Orange Free State, Swaziland, Basutoland, Natal, and Union of South Africa. Green indicates French. These areas include Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Sahara, French West Africa, Gambia, Ivory Coast, Togoland, French Equatorial Africa, and Madagascar. Light pink indicates German. These areas include Cameroon, German East Africa, and German Southwest Africa. Orange indicates Italian. These areas include Libya, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. Gray indicates Portuguese. These areas include Portuguese Guinea, Angola, Nyasaland, and Mozambique. Rio de Oro and Ifni are highlighted yellow indicating Spanish. Figure 6:17 Colonization in Africa. These maps show the rapid process of European colonization in Africa from the late 1800s A to 1914 B. Attribution on B. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. Resistance in Asia. Resistance to European colonialism took place in India as well. The Indian Mutiny of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Rebellion, was an attempt to overthrow British rule. The British East India Company's preference for indirect rule had changed, as its successes in India convinced British leaders they were capable of governing it directly. As Indian elites saw their power slipping away, they became more interested in opposing British rule. Waves of European missionaries who sought to convert Indians to Christianity had also offended many who wanted to preserve their own traditions. The activities of Christian missionaries were only one cause of Indian resentment. Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General of India from 1848 to 1856, had devised a means of gaining direct control for the British over formerly independent Indian states. It was Hindu custom for a ruler who did not have a natural heir to adopt one and to pass his kingdom to him upon his death. Dalhousie, however, introduced the doctrine of the lapse, which gave Britain the right to approve any such adoptions and to annex states without heirs. Under this policy, adoptions were rejected, and states annexed beginning in 1848. Even though the practice affected primarily states with Hindu rulers, British usurpation alarmed all members of India's aristocracy. Britain's confidence in the superiority of its own culture also led it to attempt changes in customary Hindu practices in ways that angered many Indians. The British attempted to end the Hindu practice of sati, in which Hindu widows were expected to burn themselves alive on their husbands' funeral pyres, and passed a law allowing these widows to remarry. The British also introduced Western schooling with English as the language of instruction, not Persian, the language favored by the Mughals and the language of literature and scholarship in many Islamic empires. The young men who attended these schools were preferred by the British for positions in business and government. Because British schools were more prevalent in Hindu-majority areas, Hindus threatened to supplant Muslims in positions of authority that Muslims had held for centuries. Long-simmering anger against the British turned into violence in response to the introduction of the Enfield rifle, which used lubricated cartridges that soldiers had to bite open before loading. The lubricant had been beef or pork fat, but pork is taboo for Muslims and Hindus believe cows are sacred. The British attempted to correct the problem by using another lubricant, but Indian troops remained suspicious, and some began to believe the British were intentionally using lubricants made of offensive materials to emasculate the sepoys. In March 1857, a sepoy named Mangal Pandey, a devout Hindu from the high-ranking Brahmin caste, attacked two British officers. The British executed him, and India erupted into a mass revolt. The rebelling Indians outnumbered the British during the mutiny, but the British were unified while the Indians were unable to work together across religious, ethnic, and geographic divisions. After a series of fierce battles and war crimes by both sides, the British declared victory on July 8, 1859. They celebrated with mass executions of rebel leaders, a move some British officers criticized. The Indian Mutiny convinced the British government that the owners of the British East India Company were unable to effectively govern India. The government thus abolished the company, took control of British India in 1858, and directly ruled the territory until it became independent in 1947. The period from 1858 to 1947 is therefore known as the British Raj. Raj means rule in Sanskrit, or the British paramountcy, which meant rule of India by the British government through the Viceroy of India. Growing economic relationships also led to conflict when the British tried to end China's positive balance of trade by importing opium into China from their territories in India. The Chinese had used chewed opium as a medicine and mild recreational drug for thousands of years, but in the early 19th century, users began smoking dried opium, a practice inspired by the smoking of tobacco imported from the Americas. Smoking opium led to a far more intense high than chewing it, and opium addiction became a serious problem in China. The Chinese government outlawed recreational opium in 1729, but the British traders refused to stop selling it, and the price skyrocketed. Merchants from other nations, including France and the United States, also began selling opium in China, but the British dominated the trade from their bases in India. In 1839, the Chinese government seized opium in British warehouses in Canton. In response, the British sent military forces to China with orders to impose penalties on the Chinese government and protect British merchants in a conflict later named the First Opium War. The British used their superior military technology and organization to defeat the outdated Chinese military in almost every engagement. They could not hope to conquer the huge nation, but they made repeated raids against which the Chinese were unable to defend themselves. In 1842, Great Britain and China signed the Treaty of Nanjing, which forced China to surrender Hong Kong to Great Britain, opened 5 ports to European traders, and gave the British a favorable trading status. The Chinese were also forced to pay a huge fine. The following year, a second treaty allowed British citizens in China to be tried in British courts for violations of the law, making them immune from prosecution by Chinese authorities. After a brief period of relative peace, the Second Opium War broke out in 1856 after Chinese soldiers seized a British ship in Chinese waters, crewed by Chinese sailors suspected of piracy. The British demanded the immediate return of the ship and crew and an apology. The Qing government refused, and the British Navy bombarded the Chinese coast. The French supported the British in hopes of gaining greater access to Chinese markets. The United States and Russia did not formally join the alliance, but they did provide limited support for British and French combat operations. The Second Opium War, like the first, was marked by European raids on the Chinese coast that damaged and humiliated China, but did not threaten its existence. The war ended in 1860 with the Convention of Beijing, which ceded select Chinese territories to Russia, expanded the borders of British-controlled Hong Kong, prevented religious discrimination against Christians, and eliminated almost all restrictions on foreign access to China. The treaty also led to a continuous series of other treaties between the West and China, later referred to by the Chinese as unequal treaties, because they were imposed rather than negotiated. Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. North America, the road to revolution. Europeans were occasionally victims of their own success, as when economic imperialism inadvertently created societies strong enough to form independent nations that declared independence from the home country. In at least one case, 13 former colonies formed a nation that became wealthier and more powerful than the empire that preceded it. The British colonies in North America began as struggling trading outposts in the early 1600s, but by the middle of the 1700s, they were home to more than 2 million people who largely governed themselves and enjoyed a thriving commercial economy. British mercantilist policies, however, threatened North American economic development. In the second half of the 17th century, England passed a series of navigation acts designed to maximize profit from its colonies, while denying their resources to other European powers and clamping down on efforts to avoid trade restrictions through smuggling. The Navigation Act of 1660 listed goods produced in the colonies that could be sold only in England or to its colonial possessions. Thus, English merchants paid American colonists what the merchants thought their goods were worth. The colonists were forbidden to sell to Dutch, French, Spanish, or other merchants who might be willing to pay more. Among these products were furs, tobacco, and sugar, goods for which all of Europe yearned. Also included were rice, ginger, cotton, and indigo, and other plants used to make dye. English textile manufacturers needed the cotton and dyestuffs, and to protect their interests further, the Exportation Act of 1660 also prohibited the export of English wool. In addition, naval stores for building and maintaining ships for trade and war could be sent only to England. These included masts, hemp, to make rope, pine tree pitch, which sealed ships and made them watertight, and pine tree sap used in the manufacture of turpentine. Once they arrived in England, these colonial products were heavily taxed, and the revenue went to the English government, not to the colonies that had produced them. To generate yet more income for the government, the Navigation Act of 1663 mandated that all goods bound for the colonies from outside the British Empire had first to be shipped to England and taxed before they could continue to their final destination. This provision increased the price to the colonists of non-English goods because foreign shippers passed the cost of the English taxes on to them. At the end of the 17th century, Parliament also began to prohibit colonists from manufacturing certain goods that were also produced in England, to prevent them from underselling English merchants. Colonists could not sell goods made from wool or iron, either in England or to other English colonies, and by the mid-18th century, they could not export beaver hats. Beaver hats were a popular fashion in Europe, and the English colonies actively participated in the fur trade. By allowing the colonists to export only the unfinished furs instead of the finished hats, for which they could have charged higher prices, Parliament limited the amount of wealth the settlers in the English colonies could acquire. In the wake of the French and Indian War, British colonists in North America greeted with hostility other actions by Britain's Parliament that they believed unfairly restricted their economic opportunities. Many had longed to move west of the Appalachian Mountains to establish farms on the rich lands of the Ohio Valley, for instance. New England families were large, and with each generation, parents found it difficult to provide sufficient land for their children. In the southern colonies, The demands of tobacco farming meant that new, fertile land was always in demand. Many colonies claimed territories west of the Appalachians, but this land had been taken by the French and was inhabited by their numerous Native American allies. With the British victory over the French and their indigenous allies, the colonists looked forward to finally claiming it. The British government, however, wishing to avoid antagonizing the tribes of the Ohio Valley and seeking to avoid costly new wars, promptly prohibited settlement west of the Appalachians, to the dismay and anger of many colonists who had fought alongside British troops in the recently ended conflict. Furthermore, determined to keep the peace with Native Americans and repay war debts, the British kept troops in North America who policed the frontier, regulated colonial trade, and collected taxes. The need to pay for the army's maintenance led to attempts to impose new taxes on the colonists, or to more vigorously enforce the collection of already existing ones. Colonists' efforts to evade trade restrictions by smuggling were countered with laws that required smugglers be tried in admiralty courts, which lacked a jury. Many colonists felt this practice violated protections guaranteed by the English Bill of Rights. The 1774 decision by Parliament to grant control of the Ohio Valley to the newly acquired French province of Quebec, to allow Quebec to continue to be governed by French civil law, and to extend religious toleration to the province's Roman Catholics, outraged British colonists, most of whom were Protestant. This ruling, made at the same time as one that interfered with the century-and-a-half-long tradition of colonial self-government, led many colonists increasingly to regard Britain as hostile to their interests. Growing resentment of British rule erupted in bloodshed in 1775, and a subsequent declaration of independence in 1776. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the evolution of economic theories, from mercantilism to capitalism. Analyze the ways in which mechanization challenged existing social, economic, and political structures. Discuss the ideological responses to capitalism, including Marxism. Just as colonial empires were the crucible of new political ideas and gave rise to new forms of resistance to exploitation, they also inspired new economic ideas. Mercantilism, which advocated building a nation's power by increasing trade through exports, had originally propelled colonization. But as people around the world gained their political freedom, they also became interested in economic freedom, and mercantilism fell out of favor. Capitalism, a system in which prices and costs, not government intervention, served to regulate the supply and demand of goods traded for individual profit, became popular. However, not everyone agreed with this new economic order. Marxists critiqued it and proposed systems focused on equality rather than profit. From mercantilism to capitalism. In 1681, the French finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert asked a group of French business owners, led by a man named Thomas Legendre, how the government could help them. Legendre reportedly told Colbert, "Laissez-nous faire," meaning, "let us do it." This gave rise to the concept of laissez-faire economics, which argues that market forces alone should drive the economy, and that governments should refrain from direct intervention in or moderation of the economic system. The idea of laissez-faire economics was consistent with the logistical realities of global empires. It was effectively impossible for leaders in Europe to micromanage economic operations that were on the other side of an ocean. Therefore, the evolution to a laissez-faire economic model might have been as much a practical necessity as an ideological shift. Adam Smith was a Scottish political economist and philosopher best known for writing the book An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776, often referred to by its shortened title, The Wealth of Nations, Figure 6. 18. Earlier scholars had written about various aspects of economics, but with this book, Smith became the first person to produce a comprehensive philosophical examination of the way nations should manage their economies. A drawing of a profile of a man is shown on a white background. He has white hair with two tight curls on the sides, and the long hair in the back is tied with a bow. His eyes are very round. He has a pointed nose and wears a dark coat with large buttons over a white shirt. Figure 6. 18. Adam Smith. This 19th century etching of the Scottish economist Adam Smith is based on a portrait created from life by James Tassie in 1787. Credit: Profile of Adam Smith by Adam Smith, Vanderblue Collection / Wikimedia Commons, Public Domain. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that the invisible hand of the marketplace guided people when they made their own economic decisions. By doing the work that would bring them the greatest profit, he explained, people inadvertently tended to produce the goods and services most needed by society. To allow the invisible hand to work, Smith advocated the reduction of tariffs and most forms of governmental regulation. His work was based on rational choice theory, the idea that people understand their options and make rational choices that will help them achieve reasonable objectives. In Smith's view, this form of selfishness is often good for the individual and for society. Although Smith did not use the term, preferring to call his system commercial society, he and his supporters promoted the idea later known as capitalism, an economic system in which private individuals and companies typically own the means of production such as factories and farms, and free, unregulated markets set the value of most goods and services based on supply and demand. Smith was a critic of slavery. He believed slavery was inefficient and suggested it was doomed to fail if markets were truly free. Because the cost of feeding, clothing, and housing enslaved people, however poorly, was passed on to consumers, Smith also noted that goods made using enslaved labor were more expensive. Free labor could produce goods more inexpensively because the employer did not have to pay for his laborers' upkeep. However, Smith also used rational choice theory to minimize slavery's horrors. In The Wealth of Nations, he acknowledged that the enslaved people living in the British Caribbean were in a worse condition than the poorest people either in Scotland or Ireland. But he justified their suffering on the basis that it is the interest of their master that they should be fed well and kept in good heart in the same manner, as it is his interest that his working cattle should be so. Whether sugar plantations on which enslaved people labored were themselves capitalist enterprises has been a matter of debate among historians. On the one hand, capitalism presupposes freedom on the part of all actors engaged in an economic transaction. Merchants are free to sell what they wish at the prices they wish to charge, and consumers are free to pay the price that is set or to refuse to buy the product. Employers are free to set hours and wages for employees, and employees are supposedly free to accept the employer's terms or hold out for better ones. The workforce on sugar plantations, however, consisted of enslaved people who could legally be coerced to do whatever labor their owners decided for whatever compensation they chose to give, usually the minimum of food, clothing, and shelter required to keep the laborers alive. On the other hand, plantation owners behaved in much the same way as owners of other industrial enterprises, by setting production goals. For example, many have pointed out that the highly regimented system of labor on sugar plantations was much like that in capitalist enterprises like textile factories. The debate is ongoing. What no one disputes is that the profits earned from the sale of sugar and other plantation products grown by enslaved people were often invested in capitalist enterprises, including the factories that were coming into existence in the 18th century. Adam Smith's ideas challenged the established mercantilist economic order and attracted critics. Some governmental leaders were understandably hesitant to surrender their power to the free market. They questioned the wisdom of reformers like Smith, who disagreed with the favorable balance emphasis of mercantilism. Conservative critics pointed out that while mercantilism might not have been perfect, it had delivered tremendous wealth to Europe, or at least to Europe's ruling classes. Other world leaders, most notably in Great Britain, rejected conservative critics and embraced Smith's ideas, which promised greater potential freedoms and profits for the nation's wealthiest citizens, and they became the dominant force in British economic reforms. The wealthy House of Commons leader Charles James Fox praised Smith's ideas in Parliament, although he later admitted he had not read The Wealth of Nations and thought it far too long. In 1777, Prime Minister Frederick North proposed a revised tax code based on Smith's work. In 1792, Prime Minister William Pitt praised Smith's work as the best solution to every question connected with the history of commerce or with the systems of political economy. Smith's ideas spread across the Atlantic, and in 1807, President Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Smith's Wealth of Nations is the best book to be read." As Smith's ideas took root, governments reduced tariffs, cut back on economic regulations, and led their nation's transition from the quest for favorable balances of trade to the search for personal profit. Smith's ideas remain influential, but modern scholars often criticize them. In contrast to his reliance on rational choice theory, they argue that people do not always behave rationally or make the best decisions. Others condemn the moral failings of the invisible hand, which sacrificed the lives and well-being of enslaved people, poor workers, and colonial subjects to provide elites with profit. In their own words, The Wealth of Nations, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, is better known by its shortened title, The Wealth of Nations. Published by the Scottish scholar Adam Smith in 1776, it was probably the first comprehensive study of economic philosophy. Always controversial, it remains an influential work today. As you read this excerpt from it, look for Smith's definition of the invisible hand. As every individual, therefore, endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest value. Every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. How would you explain the idea of the invisible hand in your own words? What are some potential benefits and drawbacks to a society's reliance on the invisible hand? Do you always act in your own economic best interests? Do others? Does the invisible hand work better for some people than others? Why or why not? Mechanization. In the late 1700s, Western European nations began to adopt mechanization, the use of machines to replace the labor of animals and humans. Mechanization set the stage for the Industrial Revolution, a transition away from societies focused on agriculture and handicraft production to socio-economic systems dominated by the manufacture of goods, primarily with machines. People in many places, including China, Egypt, India, Greece, and Rome, had made limited use of machinery in the ancient past. However, most goods were produced by skilled artisans for local consumption. Beginning in the mid-1600s, the British enjoyed an agricultural revolution that allowed smaller numbers of farmers employing fewer farm laborers to produce a surplus of food, and that in turn led to a population increase. In the 1700s, entrepreneurs in England found a way to make use of unemployed or underemployed farm laborers and their families. These entrepreneurs provided farm families with raw materials and asked them to produce finished goods in their cottages, a system that became known as cottage labor. Rural women spun wool or flax into thread, and men then wove it into woolen cloth or linen. Some farm families made bonnets from straw. Other people made nails, knit hosiery, or made lace. The entrepreneur collected their finished products, paid them for their labor, and sold the finished goods in towns and cities. Because the farm laborers were not skilled artisans, they could not command high wages, and the entrepreneurs reaped great profits. In time, entrepreneurs began to gather laborers together in one location, a factory. This decision gave them greater control over production because they could hire managers to supervise the workers' labor. It was also easier to install machines in factories than in laborers' cottages. Although laborers might be provided with or rent relatively small machines, such as knitting frames, for their cottages. Factories came to be concentrated in towns and cities. As work moved to urban areas, so too did men and women who could not find work on farms. By the late 1700s, British business owners, supported by government policies inspired by Adam Smith, were setting up factories and hiring many of these migrant workers. During the Industrial Revolution, factories increasingly relied on machine power, most importantly the steam engine. A steam engine uses heat to transform water into steam, which expands and drives a piston to perform work. Hero of Alexandria in Egypt produced the first steam engine when he created the Aeolipo, a simple turbine that powered toys, around the year 70 CE. Steam engines remained little more than curiosities until 1698, when the English inventor Thomas Savery used the world's first commercial steam engine to pump water out of mines and to supply water for industrial water wheels. By 1776, British factories were powering some of their operations with improved steam engines designed by the Scottish engineer James Watt. Locomotives and boats powered by steam engines soon delivered raw materials to the factories and transported finished goods to consumers. In 1807, American inventor Robert Fulton began operation of the first successful commercial steamboats. In 1812, Matthew Murray, an English industrialist, opened the world's first successful steam locomotive line. Several inventors produced steam-powered vehicles that could travel on roads, but the heavy weight of steam engines and the poor conditions of most roads doomed them to failure and kept steam engines in the factories, waterways, and railroads. Industrialization, motivated and enabled by capitalism, created tremendous wealth for business owners and middle-class professionals, but their profits often came at a high cost to workers. The production of goods shifted from the handiwork of highly skilled middle-class artisans to mechanized production, done by low-paid, unskilled laborers. Workers did enjoy access to new consumer goods made cheaper by industrialization, but to afford those goods they had to work long hours, in difficult and often dangerous conditions. Perhaps most importantly, workers lost control over their working conditions. Farmers and artisans, particularly those who owned their land or shops, were free to decide how and when they worked, whereas factory owners carefully regulated every aspect of their workers' professional and even personal lives. For example, the 1848 Employee Handbook for the Hamilton Manufacturing Company stated that the company will not employ anyone who is habitually absent from public worship on the Sabbath, or known to be guilty of immorality. Some workers rebelled against industrialization, which threatened their status as skilled laborers. Beginning in 1811, a secretive group of British textile workers calling themselves Luddites began destroying textile machinery, rioting, and setting fires in response to the industrialization of their workplaces. Figure 6. 19. They took their name from the mythical Ned Ludd, a worker who supposedly destroyed a mechanized loom rather than submit to industrialization. As the Luddite movement grew, so did the legend of Ned Ludd, until some workers claimed that King Ludd lived in Sherwood Forest and fought corrupt industrialists. much as Robin Hood had opposed corrupt authorities during the Middle Ages. The Luddites did not argue in favor of a specific ideology or a grander purpose. They were simply angry that industrialization was destroying their traditional way of life, and they fought back with every tool at their disposal. A drawing shows a large machine with semicircular pieces running along the middle toward the far back. The tops of the circular pieces are connected to bars that run horizontally across the ceiling of the inside of the building. Large posts line the machine on both sides. Patterned cloth is coming out of the machine at the front. A man in dark knickers, shoes, and vest over a white shirt on the left is holding a mallet over his head in front of the machine. The man on the right is dressed in a white shirt and dark pants and shoes, and it's striking the side of the machine with his mallet. Figure 6. 19 Luddites revolt. Luddites were workers who opposed mechanization, primarily in the British cloth-making industry. This image depicting two Luddites breaking an industrial fabric-making frame was made in 1812. Credit: Frame Breakers or Luddites Smashing a Loom by Unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. British leaders reacted quickly to the Luddites, with some calling them a mob worthy of execution. In 1812, the poet and peer Lord Byron responded by pointing out that these same people worked the fields, produced the goods, and served in the armed forces of the British Empire. Byron argued that the mob often speaks the sentiments of the people, and warned it is the mob that enabled you to defy all the world and can also defy you when neglect and calamity have driven them to despair. He urged the British government to respond to the protesting workers with conciliation and firmness, rather than violence. Most British business and political leaders disagreed with Byron and worked to suppress the rebellion. Parliament made industrial sabotage a capital offense. British authorities hanged many Luddites and exiled more to prison colonies. By 1816, the industrialists had defeated the Luddites. Today, Luddite is often used as a generic description of anyone opposed to technological change. Dueling voices. The Luddites were British factory workers who engaged in the destruction of machines, rioting, and vandalism to resist industrialization. Following are excerpts from two primary sources on the Luddites, describing separate incidents and written from different perspectives. West Riding of Yorkshire. The complaint of John Sykes of Linthwaite. Taken upon oath this 6th day of March 1812. Before me, Joseph Radcliffe, Esquire, one of His Majesty's Justices of the Peace in, and for the said riding, who saith that between 1 and 2 o'clock this morning, a number of people came to the door of his said master's dwelling house, and knocked violently at it, and demanded admittance, or otherwise they would break the door open, to prevent which this examinant opened the door, and 30 or more people with their faces blacked or disguised came in and asked if there were any ammunition, guns, or pistols in the house, and where the master was. On being told he was not at home, they secured or guarded every person of the family, and then a number of them took a pound of candles and began to break the tools, and did break 10 pairs of shears and 1 brushing machine, the property of his said master. That one of them, who seemed to have the command, said that if they came again and found any machinery set up, they would blow up the premises. Soon after which they all went away. Sworn before me, Joseph Radcliffe. The Mark of John Sykes. An account of machine breaking at Linthwaite, Yorkshire. March 1812. Sir, we mentioned some frames to be removed today from 10 miles off. They came totally unmolested. The soldiers did not go near the village, and the constables had no interruption whatever. We have been concerned to see these instances of removing frames, because it must leave some of the country people without the means of work, but it will at the same time open their eyes to the consequence of their own proceedings. For some time before these troubles broke out, in many places 1/5 of the frame workers were out of employ, and this naturally induced some hosiers, not perhaps of the first reputation, to give them particular kinds of work at reduced prices. and the hosiers who were giving the higher prices found themselves undersold in certain articles at the London market. This again brought about new arrangements, which soured the whole body of workmen. Resentment against those hosiers who paid the underprice has been the leading feature up to the present day. They have seldom made free with other property although opportunities at all times have presented themselves, and in one instance lately at Clifton, some cloths that one of the frame breakers brought away were carefully sent back again the following day. A letter sent to London from a magistrate describing the situation in Nottingham, February 1812. What are the key similarities and differences between the two accounts? Why do you think they provide such different views of the Luddites? Was the Luddite rebellion a reasonable response to the challenges posed by industrialization? Why or why not Marxism? Karl Marx was a highly controversial intellectual and revolutionary. Born in 1818 in Trier, in what is now Germany, he grew up as the son of a successful lawyer and was baptized into the evangelical church when he was 6 years old. As a young man, he studied law at the University of Berlin, where a professor introduced him to the philosophy of Georg Hegel. Marx quickly embraced Hegel's idealistic universal history, which suggested the world is progressing through conflicts toward greater freedom. After completing his education, he worked as a journalist and writer. In 1848, Marx published the Communist Manifesto with his co-author Friedrich Engels. In the book, the two argued that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Their idea, that recognizing the class struggle between workers and the ruling class is central to understanding societies, is also known as Marxism, Figure 6. 20. In addition to laying out their vision of history, Marx and Engels predicted that society would eventually replace current economic systems with socialism, a system in which the public, not private companies or individuals, owns the means of production. In their view, socialism was one phase of the transition from the private ownership characteristic of capitalism to the completely classless society of communism. They called for the forcible overthrow of current societies, a statement many communists around the world embraced as a declaration of war on capitalism. The ideals of communism were inspired by the abuses of capitalism that often exploited workers. Part A is a photo of a man sitting in a chair on a dark background, with a thin tree trunk on the right. He wears a white shirt, dark jacket and pants, has a long, coarse, white beard and long, coarse, white hair and a large black mustache. His right hand is inside his jacket and his left hand rests on his lap. Part B is an image of a beige book cover is shown with black lettering with a black rectangle border of pointy triangles all around the perimeter. The word manifest is written across the top. Figure 6. 20. Karl Marx and his work. A. This 1875 photo of Marx is probably the most famous image made by the popular British photographer John Mayall. B. Marx and Engels' The Communist Manifesto was first published in 1848 with this cover. Credit, a modification of work, Portrait of Karl Marx, by International Institute of Social History / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of work, Kommunistisches Manifest by www.marxists.org / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto with his co-author Friedrich Engels in 1848. Many writers from across the political and ideological spectrum inaccurately portray the ideas in the Communist Manifesto to support their own ideas or to paint their opponents in a negative light. Consider reading the Communist Manifesto for yourself and drawing your own conclusions about what the work says and what it might mean to you. Marx's book Das Kapital, published in 1867, is one of history's most often cited sources on economics and politics. In Das Kapital, Marx argued that the bourgeoisie, members of a social class that owned the means of production, were primarily motivated by the desire to exploit labor. In his view, employers paid wages to their workers, also known as the proletariat, that were far less than their labor was worth. They then kept the excess value produced by wage earners, in a process Marx argued was unfair to the workers. Employers used their profits to purchase additional resources and to buy political influence to ensure that the law would support the wealthy instead of the workers. The wealthy became unfit to rule as they increasingly leveraged their growing economic and political power until workers were left powerless and in poverty. Eventually, the capitalist system would collapse and the workers would reclaim control of society. The past meets the present. Marx on capitalism and communism. Karl Marx died almost 150 years ago, but his ideas remain widely debated. In 1867, Marx published the first volume of Das Kapital, and it quickly reached a wide audience among those interested in history, economics, and politics. After his death in 1883, Friedrich Engels, his co-author on the Communist Manifesto, published the second and third volumes of Das Kapital based on Marx's notes. In this quote from Das Kapital, Marx explained his view of the origins of capitalism. The economic structure of capitalist society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former. The historical movement which changes the producers into wage workers appears, on the one hand, as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds, and this side alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But on the other hand, these new freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production, and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. Karl Marx, Das Kapital. Long after Marx's death, his ideas continued to provide inspiration for people dissatisfied with inequality between social classes and angered by injustices. In 1917, revolutionaries in Russia, inspired by Marx's ideas, overthrew the government and established a new communist society that became the Soviet Union and existed until 1991. Subsequent communist revolutions gave rise to governments that still exist in China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and Laos. Even in capitalist countries, communist and socialist political parties exist and are often quite popular with voters. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont proudly calls himself a socialist, although, as many have pointed out, he does not seek to overthrow capitalism or advocate public ownership of the means of production. What is capitalism, as described in this excerpt from Das Kapital? According to Karl Marx, what are its origins? How does Marx's view of history agree or disagree with what you know about history? Are Marx's ideas still relevant today? Why or why not? What would Marx say about the history of the world since his death? Have events since 1883 supported or undermined his arguments?